7:38 p.m. On Wednesday, May 5, 1999, Debbie Griggs made what should have been an ordinary phone call. She rang her sister-in-law, Lisa, to confirm she would drive her the following morning to the mother and toddler group they regularly attended together. They finalized the plan, exchanged their goodbyes, and ended the call. Debbie never made that journey. She was 34 years old, a qualified nurse, the mother of 3 young boys aged 6, 4, and 18 months, and she was expecting her 4th child. Sometime later that same evening, inside the family home she shared with her husband, Andrew Griggs, in Deal, Kent, Debbie was murdered. Her body would remain hidden for the next 23 years. Throughout that time, Andrew Griggs repeated the same account. He maintained it during the missing person investigation, through his murder trial, after his conviction, and even while serving a life sentence. From prison, he would eventually make one final attempt to reshape the story in his favor. This is the story of Debbie Griggs. Debbie was born and raised in Deal, a close-knit seaside town on England's southeast coast. Her family had deep roots there, surrounded by relatives and lifelong friendships that stretched across generations. Before becoming a wife and mother, she trained as a nurse and worked in residential care homes. That detail matters, because caring wasn't simply part of her personality, it was something she had dedicated herself to long before she had children of her own. She had built her life around compassion and service. Witness statements and court records consistently described the same woman: warm, dependable, generous, and quietly independent. During the trial, even teachers from her eldest son's school spoke about her character. At sentencing, the judge made a point of rejecting the image Andrew would later try to create. Debbie Griggs, he said, was no shrinking violet. She noticed problems, she spoke up, and she refused to remain silent. That distinction would later become important because, for more than 2 decades, the man who killed her tried to portray her as emotionally unstable and unable to cope. Andrew John Griggs, born on August 26, 1962, also grew up in Deal. His life revolved around the sea, hard work, and the family business. A former deep-sea fisherman and experienced sailor, he knew the Kent coastline well. His family had operated Griggs Freezer Center on South Street for around 3 decades, and after he married Debbie in 1990, the business became part of their shared lives. To many people, Andrew appeared to be a hard-working businessman and devoted family man. Debbie herself acknowledged he could be a caring father when he chose to be, but the court found that the reality inside the home was very different. While Andrew spent many evenings pursuing his own interests, Debbie carried the responsibility of raising the children, running the household, and helping manage the family business. Looking like a committed father, the judge suggested, was not the same as consistently being one. Even before the marriage, Andrew had experienced a failed business venture serious enough to require support from the community psychiatric nursing service. According to the sentencing judge, Debbie only discovered this after their wedding, an early indication that Andrew carefully managed his image and disclosed information only when it suited him. By 1997, the couple had 3 sons, the youngest born in October that year. Debbie was balancing the demands of caring for children aged 6, 4, and 18 months, while also working part-time in the family business. In an affidavit prepared before her death, she described a marriage in which Andrew treated their shared assets as though they belonged only to him, restricted her independence, and consistently put his own priorities first. Whenever she challenged him, he dismissed her as sick and mad. Debbie had experienced postnatal depression after the births of her first 2 children. She sought professional help, received treatment, and stopped taking antidepressants in March 1995, 4 years before she was killed. That history would later become central to Andrew's version of events, as he attempted to use a resolved medical condition to support a story the court ultimately found to be entirely false. The court ultimately found that Debbie was not suffering from clinical depression at the time of her disappearance. That finding would later become important because Andrew repeatedly pointed to her earlier mental health history as part of the explanation he gave for why she had supposedly left. From the latter half of 1998 into the spring of 1999, Andrew was involved in a relationship with a teenage girl who remains anonymous under reporting restrictions. According to the court, she was 14 or 15 years old at the time. The court later found that Andrew had manipulated the girl's vulnerability and become increasingly fixated on her. Debbie gradually came to suspect what was happening. She confronted both Andrew and the girl, but each denied there was any relationship. The affair nevertheless continued. The sentencing judge later found that Andrew openly flirted with the teenager, even in Debbie's presence, adding further strain to an already deteriorating marriage. In February 1999, Debbie told Andrew she was expecting another child. Rather than offering support, he questioned whether the baby was his. The judge described that accusation as entirely unfounded, particularly given that Andrew himself was being unfaithful. Evidence presented at trial also showed he urged Debbie to end the pregnancy, and even suggested that their youngest son might not be his. Debbie was pregnant, caring for 3 young children, and facing rejection from the person who should have been supporting her most. Despite everything happening around her, Debbie was not someone who simply accepted the situation. She was paying close attention and taking practical steps to protect herself. Because the family business was jointly owned and company cheques required signatures from both partners, Debbie took possession of the business cheque books. She later described them to people she trusted as her ace up her sleeve. She understood that she was legally entitled to half of the business and wanted to ensure those rights could not simply be ignored. By the final week of Debbie's life, pressure was mounting on 2 fronts. On Tuesday, May 4, 1999, Andrew traveled with the teenage girl to Folkestone, away from Deal, and later telephoned her after she returned home from school. The following day, Andrew's parents signed a bank guarantee allowing him to open a new business account solely in his own name. At the same time, the existing joint account that required both Debbie's and Andrew's signatures was being closed. Without Debbie knowing it, the checkbooks she believed protected her financial position were about to become worthless. The prosecution also relied on evidence from a business associate named Peter Monks. According to testimony heard at trial, Andrew had complained bitterly that Debbie wanted half of everything they owned and had expressed a wish that she were dead. The sentencing judge rejected any suggestion that these remarks had been made casually, concluding they reflected Andrew's genuine state of mind. By the evening of Wednesday, May 5, both sources of conflict, the relationship with the teenage girl and the growing financial dispute, had reached a critical point. The court concluded it was likely that the final confrontation inside the family home was triggered by Debbie discovering that Andrew had continued the relationship and realizing what had happened to the family business without her knowledge. At 7:38 p.m., Debbie called her sister-in-law, Lisa Vickers, to confirm they would travel together the following morning. Nothing about the conversation suggested anything was wrong. She sounded calm and was making plans for the next day. Less than 4 hours later, at 11:20 p.m., Andrew telephoned his friend, Lloyd Dunley, with whom he regularly traveled to Billingsgate Fish Market, to cancel that night's journey. He offered an explanation for canceling but made no mention of Debbie. The trial judge was satisfied about what had happened in the hours between those 2 calls. By the time Andrew spoke to Lloyd, Debbie had already been killed inside the family home, while their 3 young sons slept upstairs. During the early hours of May 6, neighbors reported seeing Debbie's white Peugeot being driven from the property. One witness saw it reversing out at around 2 a.m., while another later observed it leaving again at approximately 4 a.m. The judge concluded that Andrew made 2 separate journeys during the early hours of May 6. The first was to dispose of Debbie's body, leaving his 3 sleeping children alone in the house. The second was to abandon her car on a residential road known as the Shrubbery, a location familiar to him through his delivery work, close enough to walk home yet unlikely to attract immediate attention. On the morning of May 6, Andrew began telling friends and relatives that Debbie had left the family home following an argument. According to his account, she had said he would soon find out what it was like to care for the children on his own before driving away. One detail stood out to the trial judge. Although Andrew claimed his wife had walked out, he made no attempt to contact Debbie's parents. The court considered that omission significant. Had he genuinely believed she had left after a domestic dispute, Informing her family would have been one of the most natural things to do. Instead, Andrew's mother came to the house. So did the teenage girl. Before contacting the police, Andrew asked her to wash his laundry, including the black jeans he had been wearing the previous evening. Only after those clothes had been washed did he report Debbie missing. When officers attended the property, they noted that Andrew appeared calm. During his conversation with the police call handler, he said Debbie had previously experienced postnatal depression, that she was pregnant, overwhelmed by caring for 3 young children, and had left home before, only to return later. The picture he presented was of a woman who had simply reached a breaking point. The court would later reject that account. Almost a week later, Debbie's white Peugeot was located on the shrubbery, where it had been abandoned. A forensic examination uncovered 2 findings that would remain central to the prosecution's case for the next 2 decades. First, the lining from the boot had been removed, suggesting an attempt to eliminate forensic evidence. Second, despite that effort, investigators found a smear of Debbie's blood on an interior panel inside the boot. The sentencing judge later described it as a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence. Even so, in 1999, the investigation faced major obstacles. Debbie's body had not been found. There was no confession, and Andrew consistently maintained that she had chosen to leave. Without sufficient evidence to bring a murder charge, Debbie was officially recorded as a missing person. The investigation gradually lost momentum, while Andrew remained both the principal suspect and the parent raising their 3 sons. As the years passed, Andrew continued with his life. He cared for the boys, later remarried, and blended his family with that of his new partner, who also had children. Together, they eventually moved to Dorset. He presented himself as a husband whose wife had abandoned the family and who had rebuilt his life despite difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, the boys grew up believing the explanation they had been given. They were told their mother had walked away, that she had been struggling, and that leaving had been her own decision. Without answers, they had no grave to visit and no certainty about what had happened to her. In 2007, 8 years after Debbie disappeared, Andrew successfully applied to have her legally declared dead. That declaration allowed him to remarry, placing the story he had maintained since 1999 into the official legal record. Debbie's family, however, never accepted that explanation. Her mother continued to campaign for answers, marking each anniversary of Debbie's disappearance with fresh media appeals. She remained convinced her daughter would never have voluntarily abandoned her children. She died in January 2019, only weeks before Andrew was finally charged with murder. Following a cold case review, Kent police charged Andrew Griggs with Debbie's murder later that year. He pleaded not guilty. Although Debbie's body had still not been located, prosecutors argued that the circumstantial evidence formed a compelling and consistent case. They said Andrew had 2 clear motives: the financial consequences of a separation, including Debbie's legal entitlement to half of the family business, and concern that she would expose his relationship with the teenage girl. The prosecution relied on several key pieces of evidence, including the blood found inside Debbie's car, the missing boot lining, Andrew's changing explanations, his conduct immediately after Debbie disappeared, and the testimony of Peter Monks. Jurors also heard extensive evidence about Debbie herself, her commitment to her children, the ordinary phone call she made at 7:38 p.m. on the evening she died, and the plans she was making for the following morning. The prosecution argued that nothing in the evidence supported the suggestion that she had willingly abandoned her family. On October 28, 2019, the jury found Andrew John Griggs guilty of murder. 2 days later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. In passing sentence, the judge identified 2 particularly serious aggravating factors. Debbie had been pregnant when she was killed, and her body had been concealed, depriving her family of the truth and a place to mourn. The judge also observed that genuine remorse would have involved admitting responsibility and revealing where Debbie's remains had been hidden. Andrew had done neither. At sentencing in 2019, the judge stated that he could detect no genuine remorse. Debbie's body had still not been found, and her family remained without the answers they had sought for 2 decades. Those answers finally began to emerge in October 2022, 3 years after Andrew's murder conviction, and 23 years after Debbie's death. Specialist officers searched the rear garden of Andrew's former home in St. Leonard's, Dorset. Beneath the concrete base of a former lean-to structure, they uncovered a barrel-shaped container wrapped in blue tarpaulin. Inside were human remains that post-mortem examinations later confirmed belonged to Debbie. Investigators also recovered several items buried alongside her remains, including a pillowcase, a duvet, men's and women's clothing, and the lining from a car boot. That boot lining matched the piece missing from Debbie's Peugeot since 1999. Prosecutors had long argued it had been removed in an attempt to eliminate forensic evidence. Its recovery provided further confirmation of the sequence of events already presented at trial. The burial site itself had later been covered by a wooden structure with a concrete foundation, concealing what lay beneath for many years. The discovery did not happen because Andrew voluntarily disclosed the truth. Instead, while serving his sentence, he revealed the burial location to one of his sons as part of a plan intended to challenge his conviction. According to the prosecution, Andrew asked his son to travel to Dorset, recover Debbie's remains, remove some of her hair, take it overseas, and arrange for a letter to be sent claiming to be from Debbie, suggesting she had chosen to disappear. Rather than carrying out that request, the information reached the police. Officers excavated the garden, and Debbie was finally found. On June 2, 2025, Andrew Griggs appeared before the court again and admitted perverting the course of justice. During sentencing, Hetch James described his conduct as a calculated attempt to undermine a murder conviction that had already been upheld. The judge said he remained unable to identify any genuine remorse despite Andrew's guilty plea. Andrew received an additional 3-year consecutive sentence, extending his earliest possible release date to 2041. From a legal perspective, the Debbie Griggs case remains one of the clearest examples of what prosecutors describe as a no-body murder conviction, a case in which guilt is established even though a victim's remains have not yet been recovered. Such prosecutions are uncommon because they depend on a consistent body of circumstantial evidence rather than a single decisive piece of proof. Investigators must demonstrate that every significant fact points toward the same conclusion while reasonably excluding alternative explanations. One of the most important forensic findings was the blood discovered inside Debbie's car. By itself, the stain would not necessarily have been enough to secure a conviction. Its significance came from the surrounding evidence. The boot lining had been deliberately removed, indicating an effort to eliminate forensic traces, yet a small amount of blood still remained. Combined with the location where the vehicle had been abandoned and the wider evidence presented during the trial, those findings formed a coherent forensic narrative that the jury ultimately accepted. Andrew later challenged his conviction before the Court of Appeal in 2022, arguing that evidence relating to his relationship with the teenage girl should not have been admitted because it was unfairly prejudicial. The appeal judges rejected that argument. They concluded the evidence was directly relevant to establishing motive, explaining the state of the marriage and what Andrew stood to lose if the relationship became known. Later that same year, the recovery of Debbie's remains and the missing boot lining further reinforced the evidential chain that had already persuaded the jury beyond reasonable doubt. The court record also reveals a consistent pattern in Andrew's conduct. Rather than acting impulsively, prosecutors described years of sustained deception and careful image management. After Debbie disappeared, he remained composed when speaking with police, presented himself as a devoted father whose wife had voluntarily left, obtained a legal declaration of her death, remarried, and built a new life elsewhere. The later attempt to manufacture evidence from prison followed that same pattern. Throughout the proceedings, the courts concluded that Andrew repeatedly sought to preserve a false narrative rather than accept responsibility for Debbie's murder. For much of this case, the evidence pointed to a consistent pattern. As long as Andrew could control the story, he could influence how others understood Debbie's disappearance. His greatest mistake was believing that version of events would never be challenged. The court also identified a recurring pattern in the way Debbie's past was presented after she vanished. Years earlier, she had experienced postnatal depression, sought professional treatment, recovered, and moved on with her life. Yet that resolved period became part of the explanation Andrew offered for her disappearance. Her understandable reactions to the breakdown of her marriage and the financial disputes between them were portrayed as signs that she had simply decided to walk away. During the trial, however, the court concluded that the evidence did not support that account. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of this case is its impact on the children. On the night Debbie was killed, her 3 sons aged 6, 4, and 18 months were asleep inside the family home. According to the court's findings, Andrew left them alone while driving away to dispose of Debbie's body. The sentencing judge identified that as an aggravating feature of the offense. But the consequences for those boys did not end that night. For the next 23 years, they lived with the belief that their mother had voluntarily abandoned them. They were raised with a version of events that suggested she had chosen to leave rather than remain with her family. The judge observed at sentencing that the boys had grown into fine young men, but made clear that this could not reduce Andrew's responsibility. Those years had been shaped by a false account of what had happened to their mother. Debbie was 34 years old. She was a nurse, a mother of 3 young boys, a daughter, a sister, and she was expecting her 4th child. On the evening she died, she was making ordinary plans for the following morning, unaware that they would never happen. For more than 2 decades, the account presented by the man responsible shaped what many people believed about her disappearance. Yet the jury reached its verdict before her remains were ever found, and the later discovery of her body confirmed the case the prosecution had built through years of careful investigation. For Debbie's family, especially her mother, who spent her final years tirelessly seeking answers, but died before seeing justice fully unfold, telling Debbie's story is one way of ensuring she is remembered for the life she lived, not simply the crime that took it. If this story stayed with you, you can also watch our previous documentaries on the Jennifer Murillo Sheffield case, Amy Fanyon case, and Becky Watts case, all appearing on your screen now. If you found this documentary worthwhile, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.